Do you remember your first comic shop experience? Greetings, people of the internet. I'm Scott with Serkworks Art Labs. Welcome, mad creators, to the underground laboratory where we create robots, aliens, zombies, and other imminent threats to humanity. And where can you find all those things? Well, you can find them in the pages of comic books. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys that are watching this channel are probably into comics. I write and draw comics as well as some other things. And I talk a lot about comics on the show. And a lot of you guys are comic book artists or aspiring comic book artists, or, you know, or just into comics. And that's really cool. I mean, so this channel, you know, we focus quite a bit on comics, and I was, you know, through a number of, well, let me go back. So last week, on the Artcaster show that I do with Joshua Kimball, we had Peter Simeti on, who is the publisher of Alterna Comics, who is really doing some really cool things, kind of bringing things back to basic, printing on newsprints, trying to get comics out on stands, and he's really pushing for people to support your local comic book shop. And so that's sort of been on my mind. And then I watched a video that Josh did with another friend of mine, Corey Kerr. They have a thing called the 24-hour art check, where every 2 days they kind of catch up with each other and kind of compare notes and talk about what they're doing in order to make sure that they're staying on task with their projects and everything. And it's kind of a cool thing, and other people have branched off and started doing that as well. But they had a comment from Marshall Lee. I'm throwing a bunch of names out here, and I'll try to leave links to all these places in the description. So Marshall Lee, who you may know, because a while back we did a collab where we did a thing called Take Me to Your Leader Tuesday, where every Tuesday for a month we were doing an alien drawing and everything, and that was kind of a collaboration that we did. So anyway, so Marshall Lee had a question for Josh and Corey, and that was, what's your first comic book store experience? And I thought that was kind of cool. So I'm listening to this 24-hour art check, and they're talking about it, and I just really found it very interesting. At the end, they had a sort of a call to action, saying, you know, tell us about your first comic book store experience, and if it's too long to put in the comments, do a video. So I'm thinking, well, that's pretty cool. And then they said hashtag it with my first comic shop. I don't know if they checked to see if that was a hashtag or not, but let's try it out. I'll hashtag it on this, and I like for you guys to do the same thing, because I think it's really interesting to hear other people's stories about, you know, the first experience going to a comic book shop. And I think the more we do that, the more we can kind of remind ourselves how important comic book shops are to us, and hopefully they will stick around. And with people like Peter Simeti from Alterna really leading that charge and doing some really cool things to help promote local comic book stores, hopefully that will be the case, because I'd hate for them to go away. So yeah, I thought I would talk to you about my experience. And I don't know if it's when they were first talking about this, I was like, well, yeah, I don't know if my experience is anything special, but everyone's got their own little, you know, their own story and everything. And my memory may not be the best, so, you know, and sometimes your mind does weird things to fill in blanks, so I'll do the best I can. But yeah, I thought I'd talk to you about my first comic book store experience, and just my experience growing up with comics and everything, and not just my first comic book store experience, but kind of when I first discovered comics and everything like that. So my earliest, I think the first comic book I ever owned, or I may have had comics before, maybe somebody had handed one down, or maybe given me a comic or something, but the first one I actually picked out, I believe it was an Avengers comic, and I don't remember, I may still have it, I don't know, but I remember the cover, the background of the cover being sort of like a solid purple, and again, this could be my mind but it was, I don't remember much about that other than it had a bunch of cool heroes in it. So, so that was the first comic book I think I bought. So when I was a kid, my dad built swimming pools. So sometimes he would take me along with him, or like if he was going to the dump or something, and you know, I don't know, just to keep me occupied or something, sometimes I would go to him. And a lot of stuff that was either boring, or maybe he'd have me help out, and as a reward, he would take me to the 7-Eleven, and back then there were comics in the 7-Eleven, and I'd like to see that happen again. And of course, back to alternative, that's something they're trying to do, is get comics not only in comic shops but out in you know, in the not the direct market, but the newsstands, I guess, which doesn't necessarily mean like the newsstand, like the old newsstand where you're just off the street, like in New York, like you see in the Superman movies and stuff like that, where you go and you put the quarter down and you go. But newsstand meaning just anywhere other than, I think, comic book stores or online or whatever. So he's really trying to get that going, and what he's going to do, and I'm going on a little tangent, but it all relates to comic book stores, is he's putting an ad in the back of the comic saying, hey, if you like this, you can get more, and he just lists all the comic stores that carry their products, so you can find one. So I'm looking forward to that kind of being implemented and sort of bringing stuff back to the comic stores. But anyway, back to what I was talking about. So, you know, my dad would take me to the 7-Eleven. I got to pick out a couple comics. And I would buy things like, I remember like ROM and Micronauts and occasionally superheroes, some Iron Man, stuff like that. The thing that really got me into like collecting comics, because before I would just I'd buy this issue or that issue of different titles and everything, and I'd read them, and sometimes, you know, was it Jim Shooter that said every comic is somebody's first comic or something like that? I don't remember, but so they weren't as hard to get into, I think, as maybe they are nowadays. So anyway, I had bought this this comic, Alpha Flight number, I believe it was number 11, John Byrne Alpha Flight, the first run of Alpha Flight, and so I'm reading it on I think it said, no, it basically, upon reading this comic book, I got to learn a little bit about the characters and everything, and there was a leader of the group. At the time, I think he had a couple different names. I think he started off as Vindicator, and then he changed his name to Guardian. But he was sort of the leader of Alpha Flight. And if you don't know the history, there'll be some spoilers, because I was spoiled on this too. So anyway, so I bought this comic book, and the way it ended was, it said, "And one shall surely die." And at this point, you know, nowadays when a character dies in the comics, in a year they're back again. And I either didn't know that, or sometimes back then characters would actually stay dead, at least for a while, until, you know, decades later they may bring somebody back. But anyway, so it ended up with this cliffhanger that one of the members of the team was going to die. And I was talking, I remember going back to school, and I must have been talking to somebody who knew a little more about comics than I did, and I had mentioned that. I mentioned this book that I had, and that, you know, I can't wait for the next issue and everything. And the kid said, "Oh yeah, it's Guardian, he's dead." You know, and I'm like, "How did you know? I just bought this, it's like brand new, it says the month and everything on the cover." And he says, "Yeah, well, I get it at the comic store. The comic book stores have them before they come out at 7-Elevens and everything." So he kind of spoiled it for me, and I'm like, this kid's lying, there's no way. So I waited, you know. and I think that's the first time I ever heard that there was a comic store, and I didn't know where one was. So I waited for the next month, and sure enough, I pick up the book, open it up, and the leader of of Alpha Flight dies at the end. I'm like, you know, out of all the members, it was the leader who died. And you know, I went in from there, and it was kind of cool, because his wife ended up taking over and everything. And I don't know if that's the way it was planned from the beginning or whatever, but that was a huge shocker for me, and I'm assuming it would be more of a shocker if you were invested from the beginning. Which eventually I went back and I got all the previous issues and all that stuff, and when I did finally discover a comic book store. But my first actual comic book store, and I don't know if this was technically a comic book store, but again, I was probably out with my dad or something. There was this strip mall with a hardware store, and there was a bookstore there, and they must have had ads in the front of comics or whatever. So, because I don't know if I had been in that bookstore, if somebody had been in that bookstore before, and they didn't. For some reason, I think they may have just started selling comics, and they must have been doing well for them, because they moved all the books, and I don't know if they were like used books or they probably had new and used or whatever, but they kind of moved them to the back and in the front of the store. And this was a very small, just a regular size, you know, strip. Well, I guess a lot of comic stores are like that. But they moved all the comics to the front. And so yeah, when I went there the first time, it was like, oh man, this is awesome, you know. And I, you know, checking out all these comics, and from what I remember, I don't remember a lot of Marvel and DC. I know they had some stuff because I remember they had like the Dark Knight and things like that, and some of the deluxe versions of comics and things. But they had things like, you know, First Comics and Epic, which was a division of Marvel. It was their creator owned, and Eclipse Comics and just stuff like that. All these different, all these other comic book companies that I had never heard of. And, you know, and it was, you know, me and my brother, we'd go there and we'd get comics. And the funny thing was, my brother had like the Midas touch. Every time he bought a comic, it would just like go like crazy as far as price and everything. I mean, because, you know, we were buying independent comics, so they didn't have the kind of circulation that a Marvel or DC did. So some of these became popular, like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like, I think he may have bought like issue 3 or something of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and then that thing became a huge thing. Or even like a second printing of the first issue was still pretty valuable. But he would buy stuff like this. And or like there was a comic called Fish Police, which was the same thing, which eventually they made like a TV show out of, and it was a big thing for a little while. It's probably not worth anything now, but he would buy that. And there was another title he bought called Elf Quest, but everything he bought, just like within a month or two, I mean, it was just worth a lot of money. Some of that stuff he probably should hold on to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, but I think he would have done well to sell the Fish Police and maybe the Elf. It wasn't Elf Quest, it was Elf Lord. But yeah, anyway, but you know, everything I bought, and I was more into just reading and the art's what really got me into comics and everything. So, but that was cool. I would go to this comic store, and then I remember one time they had this mini comic convention. So yeah, they put on this convention, and it wasn't like in a convention hall or anything like that. It was just sort of like a street fair. Like they had like I think they had like a barbecue out there, and they had a live band, which, you know, my memory's not great, but for some reason I remember the name of the band was Ulterior Motives, and it was sort of a rock band. They probably did a lot of cover stuff, but I remember that. And you know, they would have comics. They were selling comics in the long boxes and stuff, and I think it was like a costume thing, because I remember this. My brother dressed up as a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, and you know, and this was before Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles blew up. They didn't have costumes or anything like that. You couldn't buy a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle costume in the store. There was no cartoon. There was only the comic. That was back when they all had the red bandanas. They didn't have different color headbands and all that kind of stuff. So he was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, and some people there knew it was. And then later, I think, or it might have been just prior to Halloween. It might have been like a Halloween thing leading up to Halloween or whatever. But that year afterwards, you know, with Halloween and everything, he went trick-or-treating, and like no one had any idea what he was. I mean, nowadays, oh, it's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, and his costume was kind of, you know, it was put together by, I don't know, my mom and dad or whatever, so it might not have been as accurate as something, but you could, I mean, now if you look at it, you could say, oh, that's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, but everyone like, oh, that's a cute frog, or something like that. So that was kind of cool. So I don't remember if I dressed up or not, but yeah, it was just sort of this outdoor fair, but they had like they didn't have a lot of comic book artists there. They did have a writer, and this is kind of cool. So I found this. This is an Amazing Spider-Man graphic novel. I picked this up at that event. And so it's Bernie Wrightston is the illustrator, and I'm a huge Wrightston fan. But look at this. This is, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but it is so much like The Thing. You know, I love that, Spider-Man facing this thing. And I tried to draw stuff like that back then, and you know, but oh, and look at, you know, this big dragon. And I mean, this is sort of a fantasy Spider-Man tale. But the author, Susan K. Putney, right here, she was there, and you know, she signed it. So what is it? To a great artist, from Susan K. Putney, SKP. And I only wish I would have taken this to a convention and got Bernie Wrightston's autograph too, and that would have been so awesome. But unfortunately, he's no longer with us, so. But that was cool, so I got to meet her, and like I said, they didn't have a lot of comic artists, but they did have an illustrator there. He's like a professional illustrator, and I remember he was working, like, he did this amazing paintings, and I'm like, my dad and I, and my mom probably, or whoever, we were asking, well, how do you get this look? Because it was very smooth, and it just, the look of these illustrations was just really cool. And he says, well, I use gouache, and that's the first time I'd heard of gouache. So immediately after that, I went and bought gouache, and that's the first time I think I realized as an artist that it's not the tools, the tools and things and the materials, those aren't magic. You have to know how to use them, and you can't just go buy something that another artist is using and they're great and you're automatically great. But back then I was a kid and I didn't really understand that. But anyway, and then I also picked up this thing here. This marble tryout book. It's got a lot of wear and tear, but it basically had, and I didn't really know, back then, the sizes and things you were working on. But prior to that, I was just drawing on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper on my floor. But then I realized that this thing had comic book pages and everything, and I got to see some comic book artwork, some originals and everything, and this is a really cool book. And unfortunately, I don't think they publish this anymore, but it's basically everything you would need to do to try out to become a Marvel Comics artist. So I bought that, and that was kind of cool. So yeah, it was just a really, really cool event. And so that was sort of my first comic book store experience. And like I said, later on, this is one that I could sort of ride my bike to. We would go to this store and everything, and it was just really cool. And the owners were cool, small mom and pop, which I guess most comic book stores are mom and pop operations and everything. But later, I went out and discovered places that weren't as close to me, but my mom would drive me to this. There was a comic book store called All About Books and Comics, which it's still around today in Arizona. They've moved locations, but still an awesome store. So they've been in business for a long time. And at one time, I remember they had something happened to the lease before they moved, and it was like up in the air where they would continue. But I think they did like a Kickstarter, and it kind of saved them, and they were able to raise the funds to move the store. And as far as comic book stores go, it's like one of the best looking comic book stores. The cool thing about Arizona is we've got a lot of cool comic book stores, and they all have their little thing. Like some of them are just like huge, and that's really cool. And some of them are smaller, but they're just the way the comic book store is decorated. I think a while back I did a free comic book day where I went to all these different stores, but we've got a lot of really cool comic book stores here, so that's cool. But I went there, and that's when I first kind of went back, and I was able to get back issues and stuff, because the comic book store by me, I don't think they carried a lot of back issues and things, so I was able to complete my collection of Alpha Flight, and then I started collecting like Teen Titans and all that other kind of stuff, and Crisis on Infinite Earths, and just amazing stuff, and discover George Perez and later Arthur Adams and all that kind of stuff. So, and of course, if you haven't put all this together, this is back in the 80s, so I'm an 80s kid. But yeah, so going on, I discovered different comic book stores. There was All About Books and Comics, and then in high school, later when I grew up, I kind of got out of comics for a while, and then I don't know if it was like freshman year I got back into comics. There was a comic store that opened close to my high school, so me and another friend of mine, Chris, who I wonder what he's up to, but he was kind of a cool. He was kind of like this. I don't know if he was a stoner, but he was definitely into like rock. Like he was big into like classic rock, like the Doors and Hendrix and all that stuff. And in school, I didn't really fall into any particular clique. I kind of just hung out with just people that I thought were cool, and that didn't depend if they were like a rocker or a punk or a jock, or they were into hip hop or whatever. I just hung out with people I thought were cool. But anyway, so the funny thing I just remember, and this doesn't, well, it kind of does, because he was the guy that I always went to the comic book store with, and he introduced me to the owner of this place and everything. This is the comic store that opened up. It was called Left Half Comics, because I guess part of the idea was that the left side of the comic store was supposed to be comics, and the other side was something else. And I don't know if that was the case. I think they were both comics, but when it opened, it was that way. I don't know. But anyway. that's neither here nor there. But anyway, this comic book store opened, and my friend Chris, who, like I said, he was sort of this kind of classic rock, long hair and everything. And then one summer, I came back to school, and I basically, sometimes we'd hang out after school, but that summer we didn't. But I came back, and he must have discovered punk rock, because like the long hair was gone, and it was spiky, and he had, you know, everything, his whole look had changed, just seemingly like over the summer. So I thought that was kind of fun. But anyway, so he kind of introduced me to the comic store owner, and I got to know him, and I actually ended up, and I was in high school, so I wasn't the best artist, but I actually painted the window and everything. And I wish somewhere I have a picture, and I tried to find it, I couldn't find it, but I did a mural on his window, and I remember it had Superman and Spider-Man, Gru, Johnny Quest, maybe a Ninja Turtle, I don't know, it had a bunch of different characters, and I'd like to find that, because I'm just curious how, I mean, it couldn't have been that great, because like I was just in high school, and I wasn't, you know, I don't think I was that great. Or maybe I could have surprised myself, I don't know. But anyway, and the guy didn't pay me or anything. I think he gave me like a discount in comics, and you know, that's what it was. But anyway, so I kind of got to know that guy, and at one point, my friend Chris and I went with him to where the distributor drops off the comics at this big warehouse to pick up the comics for free comic book day, and not comic book day, that wasn't even a thing back then. You know, new comic book day. So we went out there, and I got that, and that was a big experience. Wow, look, this is where all the comics are and all this stuff, and getting the boxes and doing all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of an experience. And then I think that was around freshman year. After that, I kind of discovered girls and kind of fell out of comics, which that's the cool thing about now, is you can be into comics, and there's also girls that are in comics, and you don't have to be as ashamed. I mean, geek culture and everything, it wasn't like what it used to be. It wasn't cool back then. It was kind of something you would kind of keep to yourself, or it was kind of shameful. But now the whole geek culture thing is just so cool. So it's definitely, I mean, in a lot of ways it's a better time, a little more accepting time, and you know, so in some cases there's a lot of other stuff going on right now. So that was kind of cool, kind of getting to know this, you know, comic store owner, and going and picking up the comics and painting the mural and all that stuff. I remember telling him, you know, I make comics, or something. Well, he must have known that because I was doing the mural, but I remember, you know, taking the one comic book that I kind of finished, and this must have been, I must have been talking about it, because I had made this a while previous to that, because in high school I was doing other comics and stuff. But so I had created this comic book when I was a kid. This is the only, I think at that time, this is the only one I actually finished like a full issue. It was, I had, previous to that, I had started little stories or comic strips or things like that. But so this was called The 10th Earth, and it was sort of, in some ways it was sort of a ripoff of Crisis on Infinite Earths. You could tell here, this almost looks like the Anti-Monitor, the guy. That was sort of my Darth Vader type guy. But it was also like a post-apocalyptic thing, sort of based on, like at the time, Jonah Hex had this comic book called Hex, and it was like he got transported to this apocalyptic Mad Max type world. So it was kind of that type of story. But anyway, so the idea was that I think the premise of the story was that there was like this massive overpopulation. So what they were going to do is they were going to use like this laser or some kind of device to duplicate the Earth and make a second Earth so people could live on it. And and then something went horribly wrong. While that process was going, somebody hit the button wrong or something, and it just created like 10 different Earths. And as those Earths were forming, I think the original Earth blew up. So as that Earth was being cloned, the Earth, before it blew up, it cloned it like halfway destroyed, and then it ended up like Escape from New York, where it was a prison planet there where they would just send people to, and then the main character got stranded on that island or whatever. So yeah, it was a kid. This is all kid logic. But, you know, so I was telling this story to the comic book store owner, and I'll kind of show you, you got to see, this is the whole idea of the Earth's blowing up and all that kind of stuff. But yeah. Some cringy old artwork but you know, again, I was a kid doing this stuff. Yeah. But anyway, so I was telling the premise to the comic book store owner, and you know, rather than just humoring me and oh, that's kind of cool, he's typical comic book store guy. He's kind of like, yeah, well, that couldn't actually happen because of the physics, and he just went on about all this. They just kind of wrecked my whole world. Like, oh, okay, yeah, but anyway, so, but you know, but that's kind of that's another fun part about comic book stores is some of the characters you meet in there, and so anyway, but yeah, but anyway. So those are some of my experience with comic book stores. Yeah, and then there was, you know, there were a lot of cool comic book stores. There was one that I used to go to after I kind of came back. This would have been later in the 90s, and there was a comic book store called Atomic Comics, where if you've seen Kick-Ass, that's the store, and I don't know if it's the exact same location. It was probably a set built to look like Atomic Comics. But Atomic Comics was this, I think they had a couple different locations, and it was like massive, and you know, they had commercials on TV and all of this kind of stuff. But that's the kind of the cool thing, because that store is no longer around. They went under. But it was like a big superstore, comic book store. That was kind of cool. But at least if I ever want to, you know, have memories of that, I can kind of go back and watch Kick-Ass, and you can still see the logo and everything like that. So that was kind of cool. But yeah, those are some of my experience with comic book stores. Hopefully that was entertaining. Like nothing crazy interesting, but I think everyone's got their own story, and like I said, just listening to Josh and Corey talk about their comic book experience, their first comic book stores, and how they discovered comics, I thought I'd just do this video based on that. And I'm really interested, like I said, to learn about your first comic book store experience. Now you can leave, like Corey and Josh said, you can leave that in the description, leave a little story and tell me about that, or you know, do a hashtag #myfirstcomicshop. And I'd like to do a video. Let's see if we can get this going. I'd like to hear a lot more people talk about their experience with comic book stores. So anyway, that's mine for what it's worth. Yeah, let me know about yours. And that's all I got for today. And I will see you guys later. That is all. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me here in the Art Lab. There's a lot of other great content on the channel, so click that subscribe button and you won't miss a thing. If you're an aspiring evil genius, visit Serkworks.com for all your mad science supply needs. And if you want to contact me, hit me up in the comments section or follow me on social media. I'm looking forward to it. I'll see you then.